Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, February 17th, 2022. President Joe Biden saying there is every indication Russia will invade Ukraine in the next several days, noting Russia has added more troops to the borders, even as it claims it's withdrawing forces. President Biden also continuing to express hope for a diplomatic resolution to the crisis. At the United Nations Security Council, Secretary of State Antony Blinken detailing U.S. intelligence about how the U.S. says Russia will fabricate a reason to invade Ukraine. But Russia's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs says the real reason is not enforcing the Minsk agreements passed 7 years ago that sought to reach a peaceful settlement between Ukraine and Russian-backed breakaway areas in the east known as the Donbass. Russia pointing to Ukraine and Western countries not enforcing those agreements. We'll also get updates from U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at NATO headquarters in Brussels and from the U.S. Senate looking to pass a bipartisan resolution calling for tough sanctions if Russia takes military action against Ukraine. Plus, we'll talk with a reporter about polling of the American people on what they think of the Russia-Ukraine tensions and U.S. involvement. Also today, Senate moving towards avoiding a federal government shutdown midnight tomorrow by passing another stopgap spending bill, giving time for appropriators to put together a full fiscal year package. President Biden on the shores of Lake Erie in Ohio announcing $1 billion from the infrastructure spending law to clean up the Great Lakes. And retiring Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer reflecting on today's political divides. This story from Fox News. President Biden on Thursday said the U.S. has reason to believe that Russia is engaged in a false flag operation and said he believes an invasion into Ukraine will happen in the next several days. Tensions have spiked along the line that separates Ukrainian forces from Russian-backed separatists in the country's east, with the parties accusing each other of intensive shelling. As he departed the White House, Biden said the threat of Russian invasion to Ukraine is very high, and he believes it could happen in the next several days. From Fox News, here's the president as he departed the White House.
How high is the threat of a Russian invasion right now?
It's very high.
Why?
It's very high because they have not moved any of their troops out. They've moved more troops in, number one. Number two, we have reason to believe that they are engaged in a false flag operation to have an excuse to go in. Every indication we have is they're prepared to go into Ukraine, attack Ukraine, number one. Number two, I've been waiting for a response from Putin for my letter, my response to him. It's come to that Moscow embassy. They're faxing it here. Not faxing it, they're sending it here. I have not read it yet. I cannot comment on it.
Have you been on it in any way?
Oh, yeah. Yes. My sense this will happen within the next several days.
What are the things that will Is there any diplomatic path still available?
Yes, there is. There's a clear diplomatic path. That's why I asked Secretary Blinken to go to the United Nations and make his statement today. He'll lay out what that path is. I've laid out a path to Putin as well on, I think, Sunday. And so there is a path. There is a way through this.
Are you going to call Putin? Are you going to call Putin?
I'm not calling Putin. I have no plans to call Putin right now.
Do you think he's made a final decision, sir?
President Joe Biden speaking with reporters outside the White House as he was heading out of town on a trip to Ohio. He mentioned Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the United Nations Security Council. We'll hear from him in just a moment. President also referring to that Russian response letter. CNN reports the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement following the delivery of Russia's formal response to a written document from the U.S. over Russia's security demands, and it was posted. It reads, "We state that the American side did not give a constructive response to the basic elements of the draft treaty with the United States prepared by the Russian side on security guarantees. The package nature of Russian proposals was ignored, from which convenient topics were deliberately chosen, which in turn were twisted in the direction of creating advantages for the United States and its allies. The growing military activity of the United States and NATO directly at Russian borders is alarming. In the absence of the readiness of the American side to agree on firm, legally binding guarantees to ensure our security from the United States and its allies, Russia will be forced to respond, including through the implementation of military technical measures." That formal response from Russia. Now to the United Nations Security Council. Today's meeting, actually called by Russia, which is president of the Council this month. And today is the 7-year anniversary of the Council's unanimous adoption of a resolution known as the Minsk Agreements, which was to lead to peace between Ukraine and the separatists in the east, the Donbas region of Ukraine, backed by Russia. And we'll hear from the Russian representative on this in a moment. But first, here is the Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the United Nations Security Council on how the U.S. sees Russia starting a war.
Russia plans to manufacture a pretext for its attack. This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government. We don't know exactly the form it will take. It could be a fabricated so-called terrorist bombing inside Russia, the invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike against civilians, or a fake, even a real, attack using chemical weapons. Russia may describe this event as ethnic cleansing or a genocide, making a mockery of a concept that we in this chamber do not take lightly, nor do I take lightly, based on my family history. In the past few days, Russian media has already begun to spread some of these false alarms and claims to maximize public outrage, to lay the groundwork for an invented justification for war. Today, that drumbeat is only intensified in Russia's state-controlled media. We've heard some of these basic allegations from Russian-backed speakers here today. Second, in response to this manufactured provocation, the highest levels of the Russian government may theatrically convene emergency meetings to address the so-called crisis. The government will issue proclamations declaring that Russia must respond to defend Russian citizens or ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Next, the attack is planned to begin. Russian missiles and bombs will drop across Ukraine. Communications will be jammed. Cyber attacks will shut down key Ukrainian institutions. After that, Russian tanks and soldiers will advance on key targets that have already been identified and mapped out in detailed plans. We believe these targets include Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million people. And conventional attacks are not all that Russia plans to inflict upon the people of Ukraine. We have information that indicates Russia will target specific groups of Ukrainians. We've been warning the Ukrainian government of all that is coming. And here today, we are laying it out in great detail with the hope that by sharing what we know with the world, we can influence Russia to abandon the path of war and choose a different path while there's still time. Now, I'm mindful that some have called into question our information, recalling previous instances where intelligence ultimately did not bear out. But let me be clear. I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one. The information I presented here is validated by what we've seen unfolding in plain sight before our eyes for months. And remember that while Russia has repeatedly derided our warnings and alarms as melodrama and nonsense, they have been steadily amassing more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, as well as the capabilities to conduct a massive military assault.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the United Nations Security Council in New York City. That line, "I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one," regarding the intelligence from the United States. This, writes the New York Daily News, was an implicit nod to Secretary of State Colin Powell's appearance before the Security Council in 2003, when he cited unsubstantiated and false U.S. intelligence to justify the U.S. invasion of Iraq. As mentioned earlier, today's meeting, organized by Russia, 7 years to the day of the adoption of the Minsk Agreements, and the Russian Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Vershinin saying Russia wants to implement those agreements, but it's Ukraine and the Western nations that do not.
I must say that we are very disappointed by the ostrich-like position of our Western colleagues who are trying not to see obvious things. We are surprised that they're putting into the shadow the Minsk complex of measures, but they are placing the emphasis on the Normand format. I'd like to recall the Normand format, according to Annex 2 of the resolution, is a mechanism to control implementation, but not a place where new decisions could be discussed. For 7 years, Russia has been calling in all platforms for the Western sponsors to exert pressure on Kiev to implement the Minsk agreements. They were doing exactly the opposite. So the increasing feeling of impunity pushed the Ukrainian hotheads to new excuses and military adventures against their own people, and this is what we have. We have thousands of victims of the internal armed conflict. Many millions in Donbass are still presented as foreigners in their own country. They have automatic rifles, sniper rifles, howitzers, and strike drones targeted at them. Ukrainian representatives keep coming up with new excuses not to implement their agreements and order to shell their own people.
The Russian Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister at the United Nations Security Council. At the end of his statement, he did address the U.S. and Western nation charges that Russia is on the verge of invading Ukraine.
I would like to finally say that you will be able to resist the temptation to play to the cameras and will not make this meeting of ours into a circus. Will not present here baseless accusations saying that Russia allegedly was going to attack Ukraine. I think we've had enough speculation on that, including the Security Council meeting on the 31st of January convened by the United States. We have long ago clarified everything and explained everything. And the announced date of the so-called invasion is behind us. So therefore, my advice to you is not present yourself in an awkward situation. I thank you for your attention.
Through an interpreter, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin at the United Nations Security Council meeting today. Russia today expelling the number 2 U.S. diplomat at the embassy in Moscow, the Deputy Chief of Mission Bart Gorman. Russia not giving a reason, the U.S. State Department calling it unprovoked and an escalatory step. Last of the 4,700 U.S. troops deploying to Poland to enhance NATO defenses in Eastern Europe have arrived, Pentagon officials telling the New York Times. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in Brussels, Belgium, for a meeting of defense ministers of NATO countries. Austin holding a news conference after, giving his assessment of the military and diplomatic situation.
Now, the Russians say that they are withdrawing some of those forces now that exercises are complete, but we don't see that. Quite the contrary, we see them add to the more than 150,000 troops that they already have arrayed along that border, even in the last couple of days. We see some of those troops inch closer to that border. We see them fly in more combat and support aircraft. We see them sharpen their readiness in the Black Sea. We even see them stocking up their blood supplies. You know, I was a soldier myself not that long ago, and I know firsthand that you don't do these sort of things for no reason. And you certainly don't do them if you're getting ready to pack up and go home. So we and our allies will stay vigilant. We will watch for the so-called false flag operations, where Russia manufactures a dramatic event to justify an attack, a play that we've seen them run in the past. And we will continue to explore ways to enhance our readiness, as the United States and others have done with additional troop deployments to NATO's eastern flank. And we will closely match Russian words to Russian deeds, what they say to what they actually do. Of course, one thing that Mr. Putin says he wants to do is to engage in more dialogue. And as we have said all along, we would welcome that. We believe there's still time and space for diplomacy to work, and we are in lockstep with our allies and partners towards that end. A peaceful outcome that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity represents the best outcome for Ukraine, to be sure, but also for Russia and the Russian people. If Mr. Putin is serious about achieving that sort of outcome, he will find in the United States and in this alliance no better or more serious interlocutor. And if he's not, as his deeds thus far tend to indicate, it will be clear to the entire world that he started a war with diplomatic options left on the table. It will be Mr. Putin who will bear the responsibility for the suffering and the immense sacrifice that ensues.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, news conference at NATO headquarters in Belgium. He's also making stops in Lithuania and Poland on this trip. Back in Washington, D.C., an article at thehill.com Thursday afternoon. Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, warned that he will block quick passage of a symbolic resolution supporting Ukraine and sending a warning to Russia unless it incorporates changes he wants. Paul said, "We have some amendments to it. We believe that it should say, nothing in this resolution is to be construed as an authorization of war, and nothing in this resolution is to be construed as authorizing the use of troops into Ukraine." Because of the bipartisan group trying to pass the resolution by unanimous consent, they need buy-in from every senator to allow the resolution to pass quickly. That from The Hill. One sponsor of the resolution is Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois. He spoke to reporters Thursday morning.
I wanted to start off asking you a little bit about this resolution you've co-sponsored with Senator Portman and some others on Ukraine.
Well, I think what we're trying to do is find some common ground between the two parties to make it clear that we are unified in our opposition to Putin's aggression, and let him know that we too want to remind him there's a heavy price to be paid if he does that.
Is it your sense that that would pass with unanimous consent today?
Well, we're hoping. If it's going to have any value, it needs to be timely, and he is preparing for an invasion. As late as yesterday, 7,000 more troops being moved into the theater. And facing that reality, we ought to put this together quickly.
If Russia did invade, do you get the sense that a sanctions bill would come together quickly?
I think it should, and I would support it. He has to pay a price for this. I met last week with the new chancellor from Germany, and he talked about how Europeans view this. The idea of a land war in Europe, he said, is something that people there remember. And I thought, ironically, the last land war was in 1945 with America fighting the Germans. 75 years later, more than 75 years later, we can't return to that style of leadership in Europe.
Democratic Senator Dick Durbin, who's also the majority whip, speaking with reporters. That bipartisan Senate resolution says in part that the Senate denounces the Russian military buildup as reckless and provocative and contrary to established international norms, and encourages the president that should any further invasion or other malign activity to undermine the sovereignty of Ukraine occur by Russia, the U.S. government should exhaust all tools at its disposal to impose significant costs on the Russian Federation to restore peace in Europe. A Republican sponsor of the resolution is Jim Risch of Idaho. He's ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He was interviewed by PBS Wednesday night.
The Russians lie, and I don't know how they can look in the camera and tell the world they have no intention of invading, and they have amassed the largest invasion force that the world has seen in decades. So, look, the world doesn't believe it. Nobody wants war. Everybody would like to see it avoided. The Ukrainians, I think, are in a different position than they were when Russia went into the Crimea. At that time, polling was actually showing the Ukrainian people having a favorable view of Russia at about 85%. Today, that's reversed. It's only about 15%. I think if they do go into the Ukraine, the best day they're going to have is the first day, and after that, it's going to turn into a resistance movement. And they've received enough arms from us and other people in other of our allies in Europe to make this a very, very troublesome venture.
And
the
one
Russians.
other quick question to button that up. We heard Vladimir Putin say yesterday he was interested, possibly, in negotiating with the U.S. on important matters. Do you see any sign of any diplomatic progress?
I don't. I haven't heard of any. I think I would have if they were ongoing. But look, Judy, I don't know what there is to negotiate. What Vladimir Putin put on the table were absolute non-starters for us and all 29 of our NATO allies. He wanted to say who was going to get into NATO and who doesn't. Our NATO charter is very clear that we're open to anybody who wants to come in, and we support any country that wants to come in if they meet the criteria.
Senator Jim Risch, ranking Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the PBS NewsHour Wednesday evening. A headline at 538.com, What Americans Think About the Crisis in Ukraine. Geoffrey Skelley is the election analyst at 538, looking at the polling, and he joins us now. Thank you for being with us. So what do Americans think? What have the polls been showing?
So Americans don't necessarily have super well-established views on how the U.S. should respond to this situation. A lot of the polling questions, you'll find a very large percentage of people saying, I don't know, or I'm not sure. And the polls would generally suggest that Americans would sort of prefer to stay out of the conflict as much as possible. But at the same time, you can see a clear preference among those who do sort of pick a side. They would want us to help Ukraine. Very few people are taking the Russian position on things. A poll might ask, which side would you like to see the U.S. help? And maybe half the respondents will say, I don't want us to take a side, or I don't want us to help either side. Another 45% might say Ukraine, and then 5% say Russia. So that's sort of the split. It's sort of don't want to get involved, but if we are going to get involved, we should, assist Ukraine at least in some way.
Is there a partisan difference when you ask Democrats versus Republicans?
Yeah, so, interestingly, there is at least some partisan difference. Democrats are a bit more likely to say we should assist Ukraine. Republicans are a bit more likely, and independents potentially even a little bit more likely than Republicans, to say we should stay out of the conflict as much as possible. But I think actually the bigger, more interesting split is among people by age, which is fascinating. When you think about a lot of people in this country who are older, came of age, grew up, the Cold War, Russia was the enemy, as the Soviet Union back then, of course. And older people are more likely to say the U.S. should help Ukraine. The U.S. On various questions of what the U.S. should do to assist Ukraine, they are more likely to agree or give approving answers, whereas younger Americans are more likely to be a bit more reticent about being involved in various ways. So I think that's a really fascinating divide as well.
President Biden has made a point every time he talks about this to say that he is not going to send U.S. troops to fight. Has there been polling about if the U.S. does get involved, how it should get involved, sending aid, sanctions versus U.S. troops?
Right. So, there's definitely a preference in the survey data among Americans for diplomatic or economic sanction sorts of actions over U.S. military involvement. That's for example, there was a Morning Consult poll where they asked a number of scenarios, including things like Russia just invades the eastern part of Ukraine, all the way to Russia invades and occupies all of Ukraine. And it was only in that last scenario where respondents actually preferred deploying troops to just Eastern Europe, not even necessarily Ukraine proper, over imposing sanctions. So it was only in that most extreme example that in this case registered voters responded, more favorably toward deploying troops. So there's definitely a preference for we can give them weapons, we can give them various other assistance, we can even send some troops to areas near Ukraine, but we don't really want troops on the ground in harm's way or even potentially in a situation where they might be firing at Russian troops. That's very much something people don't want.
Geoffrey Skelley is with 538. How high is it on the radar screen of the average American, say, compared to the economy as an issue of concern?
Oh, well, I think definitely compared to things like the economy, COVID, these are still greater concerns to Americans. Now, I think if Russia were to invade and this sort of was a conflict that it became sort of more involved, and you did hear about American contributions, even if it's not troops, if it's, material or other forms of assistance to Ukraine, that would probably raise the salience of it. And I think a lot would depend on sort of the nature of American involvement as just how much Americans might grow to care about it. But at this moment, I think definitely issues like the economy, COVID, inflation, things like that are much more on people's radar.
Geoffrey Skelley is an elections analyst at 538. You can read his article with all the polling summary at 538.com. Follow him on Twitter at GeoffreyVS. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And returning to the U.S. Senate, the daily session opens with a prayer, usually by the Senate chaplain, retired Rear Admiral Barry Black. Today, he referenced efforts to head off the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Let us pray. O God, you are our heavenly parent, and we thank you for every expression of your love. Though we hear about war and rumors of war, you continue to deserve our ceaseless praise. We praise you that, though wrong seems often so strong, you continue to rule your universe. Lord, why can't nations learn to live together in peace? Today, use our senators for your glory. Keep them mindful of your presence, eager to do your will, and loyal to the royal you have placed in every heart. We pray in your sovereign name. Amen.
Senate Chaplain Barry Black opening today's session. Washington Today continues in a moment.
I can report to the nation, America is on the move again.
Live Tuesday, March 1st, the State of the Union. President Biden addresses a joint session of Congress and the nation, reflecting on his first year in office and laying out his agenda for the year ahead. Live coverage begins at 8 p.m. Eastern. The president speaks at 9, followed by the Republican response, and will take your phone calls and social media reaction. The State of the Union Address, live Tuesday, March 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, cspan.org, or on the C-SPAN Now video app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. U.S. Senate moving to avoid a government shutdown by passing another short-term government funding measure. This one will be through March 11th. It'll give appropriators more time to finish a full fiscal year spending bill. The fiscal year runs through the end of September. The appropriators say they have agreed to a bipartisan framework for spending, just need to put in the details. Craig Kaplan, C-SPAN's Capitol Hill producer, tweeting about 5 o'clock that the Senate has agreed to take up and vote on 3 Republican amendments, one of them offered by Senator Mike Lee of Utah, talking about vaccine mandates. He spoke on the floor for a minute.
Mr. President, vaccine mandates are morally wrong, and they're wildly unpopular. Millions of Americans are still required by this federal mandate to be vaccinated or lose their jobs. The people's elected lawmakers here in Congress haven't instituted these mandates. No, there's no federal law putting them in place. President Biden and his bureaucrats are just treading deeply into the personal medical choices of Americans without an act of Congress authorizing them to do so. Now, Congress has the chance to make these millions of voices across America be heard. That is, after all, our job, our sole job is to make federal law, to give voice to those who elected us. We can state clearly, boldly, decisively today that federal vaccine mandates do not belong in the United States of America.
Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, on his amendment to the Continuing Resolution, or CR, which is the stopgap government funding measure to avoid a government shutdown. The Senate has in the recent past defeated these efforts to ban federal vaccine mandates. Senator Patrick Leahy, Democrat from Vermont, chairs the Appropriations Committee. He argued on the Senate floor that all amendments offered should be defeated. That way the Senate can send the bill, which has already passed the House, to the president for his signature and not have that shut down.
You know, you fund the priorities of yesterday and the world of today would be irresponsible. It's no way to govern. Our Four Corners framework provides a path to reaching a bipartisan, bicameral omnibus agreement by March 11th. Vice Chairman Shelby, Chair DeLauro, Ranking Member Granger, and I are committed to completing this work. We and our staffs are willing to work straight through until that date. So I urge members to support the continuing resolution that passed the House with strong bipartisan Republican and Democrats alike support so we can finish our negotiations. And I might say, Mr. President, the continuing resolution, and I was here at a time when something like this was simply passed by a voice vote, but it has to pass in its current form. The House is out of session. We don't have time for a long, protracted debate. The government will shut down at midnight tomorrow if we do not send the continuing resolution in its current form to the president for his signature. So I would urge all members to oppose any amendments, whether they come from Republicans or Democrats, oppose any amendments to the bill. Vote yes on final passage. Be responsible. We have to be in tonight and tomorrow to finish it, fine. But let's get it done. Come on. If you took a poll of American people, 95% of them would say, what's taking so long? Let's get it done.
Senator Patrick Leahy, chair of the Appropriations Committee, Democrat, on the Senate floor. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell promised earlier this week that after a few votes on some amendments offered by Republicans, that CR would pass the Senate, be signed into law, and there would be no government shutdown. Labor Department says applications for U.S. unemployment benefits rose last week by 23,000 to 248,000, but remain near historically low levels. The chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rouse, testifying today about the state of the economy before the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. Inflation was a prominent topic. Some questions from the committee's ranking Republican Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania.
In 2019, wages were rising, and they were rising faster than prices. And wages were rising faster for low-income workers than they were for upper-income workers. So we had workers, unemployment reached record lows also, and workers were able to improve their standard of living because their income was rising faster than their expenses. Now we're in a situation where wages are rising, but prices are rising faster. And the reality is, for most workers, they're falling behind, because the cost of the things they need to buy every week is going up faster than any increase in their income. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics in February 10th summarized it pretty neatly. They say, and I quote, real average hourly earnings decreased 1.7%, seasonally adjusted, from January 21 to January 22. The change in real average hourly earnings, combined with a decrease of 1.4% in the average work week, resulted in a 3.1% decrease in real average weekly earnings over this period. I know that's not the intention, but isn't it true, let's start with Dr. Rouse, that most low and middle income workers have experienced a bigger rise in the cost of the things they need to buy than in their incomes?
Well, I appreciate the concern very much, Senator, and we're all very concerned about inflation and appreciate that is, you know, the purview of the Fed in the short term, and it's important that we have a full slate of governors. I just would like to point out the chart on the far right.
Okay, good. I'm sorry, but look, we all know that the number of governors is adequate to do whatever they need to do about inflation. So let's not go there.
Okay, so let's look at this chart on the far.
But can you confirm the simple fact that for most workers, wages are not rising as fast as prices?
So some recent estimates by economists Emmanuel Saez and Zuckman suggest that actually, if we look at the bottom 50% of workers, that their market income before taxes and benefits is greater now than it was in Q4 2019. And you can look, if you look after taxes and benefits, that they're actually ahead. So
is your position? So we saw the number of 7.5% as the most recent annual rate of inflation. We also know that low and middle income people have a worse experience than that because they pay a disproportionate amount of their income for things that are rising more rapidly than 7.5, like gasoline, like groceries. Are you telling me that you think that the average worker in America is more than keeping up with inflation?
So what we know is that look, inflation is not, we do not want to see this level of inflation going forward. And that's why the president is focused on doing what he can. We would like, you know, the Federal Reserve is likely to adjust how its posture has been towards inflation. But we do know that household balance sheets, because of the efforts of the federal government, the Federal Reserve, have been maintained through this pandemic, which is what is reflected in this chart on the left.
Cecilia Rouse is chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, being questioned by Republican Senator Pat Toomey, today's Senate Banking Committee hearing. We covered it in its entirety. You can find the video at our website, cspan.org. President Biden talking about how the money from the $1 trillion infrastructure law from last year is being spent. In Lorain, Ohio today, he focused on Great Lakes cleanup and restoration efforts in polluted areas. The money available, $1 billion.
Back in 1987, an independent commission identified 43 places called areas of concern along the Great Lakes. There are areas where pollution, as EPA director said, where pollution from industry runoff, from agriculture, poor wastewater treatment, put the Great Lakes and everyone who depends on them at risk. 26 of these areas are on the United States side of the border. 12 of them are in Canada, and 5 are shared between the United States and Canada. And our mutual nations made a commitment to clean them up, to be good partners, to protect these shared treasures. And for decades, there was a lot of talk, a lot of plans, but very little progress. It was slow. That changes today. Today, we're announcing an investment of $1 billion. $1 billion. From the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's going to allow the most significant restoration of the Great Lakes in the history of the Great Lakes. We're going to accelerate cleanup of sites across 6 states in the Great Lake Basin, from Duluth, Minnesota to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Gary, Indiana, Buffalo, New York, and everywhere in between. We know these sites were dangerously polluted for decades. We're committed to clean them up. 3 decades ago, we made this commitment.
President Biden in Lorain, Ohio, on Lake Erie, which the Associated Press describes as a small city that once housed a shipbuilder, a Ford plant, and U.S. Steel factory, now adapting to a post-industrial economy. And concerning the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative from 2010, it's been one of the few matters, writes AP, on which the region's congressional Democrats and Republicans routinely agree. They thwarted President Donald Trump's early efforts to gut the program, which GOP lawmakers from Michigan eventually persuaded him to support. And this from the Hill, President Biden joined by Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, Democrat from Ohio, who represents the 9th Congressional District there, and is expected to face a difficult re-election later this year due to redistricting. On Wall Street today, the Dow falling 622, NASDAQ down 407, S&P down 94. National taxpayer advocate Erin Collins testifying today before the Senate Finance Committee about customer service at the IRS and the problems experienced by many taxpayers, such as only about 11% of them with questions calling on a helpline actually speaking with somebody at the IRS, and also an enormous backlog of unprocessed tax returns, 24 million from just last year, with many refunds being held up for 10 months or more. Erin Collins saying the biggest problem at the IRS is paper.
When I released my annual report last month, I said paper is the IRS's kryptonite and the agency is buried in it. I want to elaborate on that point because paper remains at the heart of the IRS challenges in the processing returns. For context, IRS received almost 170 million individual income tax returns last year. About 90% were filed electronically, and if there were no problems, it was processed quickly and the refund was paid under 21 days. But paper is different. The IRS still transcribes paper line by line, number by number. Last year, the IRS received about 17 million original paper returns, and processing delays have been running up to 10 months. And still we have over 4 million amended returns that taxpayers are waiting to be processed. And when the IRS requires additional information or proposes a change to the taxpayer's liability, it sends the taxpayer a written notice. Most likely, the taxpayer is going to respond in writing, adding to the correspondence backlog. All of these delays contribute to taxpayers' frustration and confusion. The main question I'm sure you and millions of taxpayers are asking is, what can the IRS do now to catch up on its paper backlog? As I see it, we have two plausible options. One is to leverage the IRS employees, and two, use outside vendors to assist with clerical work. The other option is to automate some of its work.
The National Taxpayer Advocate Erin Collins testifying before the Senate Finance Committee. An update today on improving the U.S. Capitol Police Force. It's been just over a year since the attack on the U.S. Capitol building, January 6, 2021. Capitol Police Inspector General Michael Bolton telling the House Administration Committee that there's been a lot of progress in implementing his more than 100 recommendations, but there's still a ways to go. Also testifying today, Daniel Schuman, Policy Director of Demand Progress Education Fund, and the committee ranking Republican Rodney Davis of Illinois, asking him about operations at the Capitol Police and also its oversight board.
As you're aware, we're here to discuss the oversight of the Capitol Police. We also know that the Inspector General's role is limited to only Capitol Police. As he mentioned repeatedly during our hearings last year, he does not have oversight authority of the Capitol Police Board. The Capitol Police Board, as you mentioned and as we mentioned, is made up of 3 political appointees, and the chief of police is an ex officio member. The board holds an unusual amount of responsibility for campus security decisions. Can you help us to understand why this structure hinders transparency? Go a little bit beyond your opening comments.
Well, sure. So there are a number of factors, some of which are already in the record. One, of course, is people have a lot of confusion about who's actually making the decision. Is it the board? Is it the chief? Sometimes the chief is in the board meetings as an ex officio member. There is not the release of the minutes of the proceedings before the board. The GAO has indicated that folks who've served on the Capitol Police Board and the Capitol Police Chief are confused about who they report to, who their overseers are, and that the staff for the relevant committees of jurisdiction didn't feel like they were being kept in the loop with respect to decisions being made by the Capitol Police Board. The architect of the Capitol, in his testimony, I think back in May, said that there needs to be more transparency and accountability in the board, that things are overclassified, that they're not made available and conversations can't happen with other folks, including staff and elsewhere, that there's a lack of dedicated staff. GAO has faulted the board for who has access to the board's manual procedures, that it wasn't routinely being provided to members of the committees of jurisdiction. And ultimately, the Capitol Police and the Capitol Police Board are not taking Congress's direction. Congress has said to the IG, or requested of the IG, that the report should be made publicly available, and told the Capitol Police to create a FOIA-like process. There have been other directives regarding arrest information, and the Capitol Police has not implemented those recommendations. All of this suggests that the Capitol Police is not able to listen in the way that it needs to the directions coming from Congress. There are also other structural problems in the way that not all members of the Capitol Police Board adequately report to all members of Congress. We saw that what I referenced before with respect to the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate being unwilling to testify in person before the House. I could go on, but I don't want to take up all your time, so I'm happy to keep talking about this.
Well, thank you. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the 2017 GAO report on the Capitol Police Board.
Without objection.
Mr. Schuman, I know you're familiar with this report, and just do you consider the Capitol Police Board to be accountable and transparent? I think we know your answer.
No, not only are they not accountable and transparent, I think they are the least accountable and transparent body that I've ever run across in the federal government. I've worked a lot with the national intelligence agencies, so that says a lot.
Daniel Schuman is with the Demand Progress Education Fund, testifying before the House Administration Committee. Questions from the ranking Republican on the committee, Rodney Davis. He and other Republicans on the committee also asking for the release of Capitol security footage from January 5th of last year. They say it's a way to answer questions raised by Democratic members about whether some Republican lawmakers led reconnaissance tours before the deadly riot, the attack on the Capitol January 6th. Republicans say they looked at the videos from that time and have found no footage of large group tours. Also today, former President Donald Trump, a judge has ruled, must answer questions under oath in New York's state civil investigation into his business practices. Also must sit for depositions two of his children, Donald Jr. and Ivanka. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who's retiring after the current term or whenever a replacement is confirmed, interviewed today as part of a program hosted by the Supreme Court Fellows Program and the Law Library of Congress. He talked about the current political atmosphere.
Everybody understands that this is a difficult time, both politically and in terms of people disagreeing with each other in the country. And so what I'm saying here is I want those who are willing to read this, in particular, it's not particularly aimed at lawyers, maybe aimed at law students, to understand that the rule of law is an important thing. It has helped keep the country together, and it isn't something that just say it, and it happens. It takes, as I said, 150 years, and I go back with examples when it did and didn't happen, and it's a very long, complicated thing. And ultimately, I said to the woman from Ghana, you have to convince the people in the villages, in the towns. You see, and it's in their interest sometimes, generally, to follow decisions that they don't like, that may hurt them, affect them adversely. And by the way, it might be wrong, because if we're 5-4, somebody's wrong. Is that? And why is that a good thing to do? And they have to understand that. And there is a period right now that I think it's difficult in that respect. Difficult to get people. So I say, what can we do about that? And what I'm really saying is not much. I say the main thing is you do your job. That's it. That's what my father used to tell me. He had two important pieces of advice before he died. That was the second one. The second one is do your job. And the first one was stay on the payroll. That's it.
Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, in a conversation with the counselor to the Chief Justice, Geoffrey, part of a program today co-hosted by the Law Library of Congress and the Supreme Court Fellows Program. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin saying today that he wants the Senate to confirm President Biden's upcoming nominee to the Supreme Court to replace retiring Justice Breyer by the start of the 2-week Easter break in April. That would be April 9th. President Biden has said he plans to nominate somebody by the end of this month. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. You can get more top Washington stories by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we're taking your calls, live, on the air, on the news of the day. And we'll discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Friday morning, we'll look at the pandemic's impact on women in the workforce with Rutgers University professor Yana Rogers. And we'll talk about President Biden's economic policy with Jonathan Bidlack of the R Street Institute. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Friday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, text messages, and tweets.